So maybe you're thinking of trying a Camino, you've heard about it, but you'd like to have a little bit of a taster or a sample. You don't feel you can kind of commit to the whole thing, whatever that is. So this week, this video is for you, coming right up. So I've been thinking about making this video, and I know the Camino Purists and Traditionalists will probably not like it. Why? Well, I thought I'd share some tips for those who are really interested in the Camino. Maybe they've heard about the Camino from friends, they're curious about it, they'd like to try it, but they don't really want to commit to, weeks of walking, or do I really have to walk 100 kilometers, and do I have to get all this gear, and I'm not really sure I like hiking, but they're kind of intrigued by it and maybe would like to just try it out. So how can you do that without making a big commitment in terms of, time and expense and so on? That is what we're going to talk about this week. And why am I going to talk about it? Well, because I was talking to a very good friend who has heard me go on about the Camino for years and said to me earlier this week, I think next time we go to Europe, we might try a little bit. And I was quite taken aback because he's never shown any interest in the Camino at all. And I sort of asked him, what his interest was, and sort of shared a few tips. And I thought, there's probably a lot of people in the same boat. Maybe they're a little bit hesitant because, the Camino has such a massive following, and a lot of people believe that, it has to be done in a certain way. And maybe there's not a lot of information shared about how you could just try it out and have a bit of a taster. So let me run through a few things, and I've got some notes here. And for the purists out there, for the traditionalists, let me just put your mind at rest. Why am I sharing this? I'm not trying to promote the Turingrino sort of type pilgrim. That's a derogatory term that's often used for pilgrims who turn up by the busload and, are more like tourists than pilgrims. I think there's a lot of people who would love to try it just for a few days to see if they like it. And then it might prompt them to come back and walk a Camino in a more traditional way, whatever that is. So if it helps you sample the Camino, let me share some tips, because I'd rather that you got to sample it than not try it at all. Okay, so in no particular order, distance. That was the first thing that came up when I was talking to my friend. And he said, what would be a good bit to walk? And I said, number one question is, do you want a certificate from the cathedral, which is, that you've walked the minimum distance of 100 kilometers? He said, no, not really bothered about that. That immediately opens up a whole raft of options for you. Now, you'll know if you've seen any of the other videos on the channel, if you want the Compostela, the certificate it's actually from the Pilgrim's Office in Santiago, you must have walked the final 100 kilometers or cycled 200 or ridden a horse for 200. So it's very specific. You have to do that final section. If you're really not worried about that, you can walk any section. So that really opens up a lot of possibilities. So that is in terms of distance. Then what about which route, whatever part of the world you're from? Because there's at least 12 or 15 different routes, Camino routes through Spain alone, and there's some that come down through France. For people who have never walked the Camino, I generally say the Camino Frances is a good one, if only because the infrastructure is probably the best. So by that I mean there's lots of different accommodations options, eating options. You don't have to walk too much distance, between places where you can find food and accommodation and that type of thing. The Camino Portuguese, I think, is similar. I haven't walked that one, but that's pretty good in terms of infrastructure. So maybe one of those two. There's the Camino Ingles, which is a shorter one up north of Santiago. But I'll talk about the one that I know best, the Camino Frances. So that could be the route. Now, the discussion I was having with my friend is which bit. And that was interesting. And I was chatting to him online, and I immediately pulled out one of Mr. Brearley's guidebooks. I'm a bit of a fan of his books. And I love these maps at the beginning of his books because they show the sort of I hesitate to call these the stages because these are not the stages you have to walk. They're suggested daily stages. But it kind of gives you a complete picture of the whole Camino. And so I started glancing through this and said, well, he's thinking maybe walk for 4 days. So they're going to Europe. They're probably going to go and spend some time in Italy, and thought it would be nice to have 4 or 5 days on the Camino. So which bit, Rob? So it's going to depend a lot on what you want. My first suggestion was maybe start in Pamplona. The reason I'm not saying start in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port is that if you're only going to walk 4 or 5 days, you've got that quite tough day one over the Pyrenees, and then really you're only going to sort of get to Pamplona. I mean, it's an interesting part of the Camino. If you were going to pick a bit of it, I'm not sure I'd pick that. I thought maybe from Pamplona, let me just find that on the map, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 days, I suggested walk to Logrono. Why would that be good? Because Pamplona is a beautiful city to start in, really attractive. You're going to get a very interesting walk over the Alto del Perdón, where the windmills are, down to Puente La Reina. I would recommend the detour to the old church at Yanate. I did that last time. You're then going to walk to Estella, which is a beautiful old town, through Los Arcos, which is a lovely small town, and then finally through Viana, which is nice, and then ending in Logrono, because I know my friend loves food and wine, and I said, well, you're going to love finishing there because you've got fantastic tapas and it's a wine region. You're in La Rioja, so that that was my first choice. I mean, there's so many options. The second choice then, I was sort of looking at it for him. I said, probably the second choice would be to start in Leon. And let me just find that. Yep, we've got Leon. There we got Leon. And I did warn him about the first section out of Leon just being on the road. So I think for someone just walking 4 or 5 days, their first time, I'd suggest grab a bus for the first few Ks or something. That's going to take you then into Hospital del Orbigo, which is a beautiful town. You've got that lovely old bridge with a jousting area next to it. You're going to have that walk up through the gentle hills. There's 2 ways out of Hospital towards Astorga. You can go along the road. If you're smart, you go up through the hills, lovely gentle rolling hills, and you get to meet David Vidal, who lives on the Camino at the, how do you pronounce it? Casa de la Dioses, House of the Gods. He lives on the Camino and has a little Donativo stand with food and drinks and things. Fascinating guy. Love chatting to him. So that takes you up there. Then, of course, you're in Astorga, which is a lovely town. You've got Gaudi's Palace there. You've got a lovely walk across to Rabanal, which is a beautiful little village at the base of the hills there. Up over Foncebadon, where you've got the Cruz de Ferro. Quite a steep climb then down into Molinaseca. And I did say to him, if you're not feeling very fit, I'd skip that downhill bit. For the purists, this is for someone who's just trying it out for 4 or 5 days. Down into Molinaseca, and then probably finish up in Ponferrada, where you've got the Templar Castle. So that was a couple of short sections that I suggested. Then it sort of came to me that, of course, you don't have to walk a contiguous 4 or 5 days. If you want to have a sampler, and actually that is what I organised for my wife Pat on her very first Camino. So I won't go through the detail of kind of how we did it, but she didn't want to commit to a big long walk. She was happy to walk the final 100 Ks from Cebriero. But I felt if that was really going to be her first Camino, it would be nice to sample some other bits. So we, through a range of different transport options, we ended up starting in Madrid. We got a train to Astorga. We then got transport to, where did we go to? Up to, did a bit of sightseeing. We went up to Foncebadon. We walked then from Foncebadon over to El Acebo, so she got to walk over the mountaintops and see the Cruz de Ferro and things like that. And then we kind of skipped forward a bit to Cebriero, so she got to see that lovely village on a mountaintop. And then went down to Tracastela, and then we skipped forward again to Cebriero to actually start our continual sort of walk into Santiago. So thinking about that made me think, with my friend, well, you don't actually have to walk sort of 4 sections in a row. You could pick to walk, A to B one day, grab a bus to another town, walk A to B another day, grab a bus, train or something to another town. So, if you wanted a sample, that would be a really good way. You could kind of cherry pick and try different parts of the Camino. Although I think even if you're trying it out for the first time, I think it's nice to actually, let's say you're walking for 4 or 5 days. I think it's nice to just keep walking 4 or 5 days continually. You get more of the feeling of the Camino rather than breaking it up all the time with transport. And you'll get to see, similar faces around you every day from the other pilgrims. You'll get more of a sense of what the Camino's like. So even if it's a sample, I think I'd suggest that you walk continually a specific section. So that's the route or the part. Time of year, what was interesting talking to my friend, he said, I love the idea of the solitude. And went, he's thinking of going in May. May on the Camino Frances is probably the busiest month. So take that into account if you're having a little bit of a sample. I mean, it depends if you like having lots of other people around. What I did say to him was that, again, if you're just walking a short section and you plan your accommodation, you can actually avoid the crowds a bit. And when I say crowds, in the earlier parts of the Camino, it's not sort of bus loads, but generally on the Camino Frances in May, you would always have half a dozen people within sight, I think, sort of behind and in front. It's rare, I think, these days that you actually get that sense of solitude. I was very lucky to have that in my first Camino in 2015, where I could walk half a day without seeing people. But you can still get a flavour of that. And what I suggested to him was, if you book your accommodation ahead, so at least for the next evening, for the next night, you haven't got the worry of trying to find a bed. So you could actually leave later than everybody else. Because most people leave quite early in the morning. I would say 7 to 8 o'clock. They want to be on the road walking and sort of finishing up, 1 or 2 o'clock when the albergues are opening and that type of thing. If you're prepared to finish later in the day, heck, you could start walking at 9 or 10 o'clock. I've done that a few times and had the path to myself. So it's another alternative way of doing it. So that was kind of time of year. Accommodation options. Of course, you'll find videos on the channel that talk about accommodation options. You've got everything from nice hotels to very modest hotels and bed and breakfast and casa rural, which are like private houses where people provide accommodation. You've got the albergues, of course, which are popular, which is generally dormitory accommodation, although many of those have private rooms as well. So again, that's why I sort of tend to recommend the Camino Frances, because in a lot of the villages and towns, you'll have a broader range of options depending of what you want. And what I suggested to my friend was not to book, let's say he's going to walk for 5 days. Don't go and book every night's accommodation before you go, even though it's only for 4 or 5 days, because you're not sure how you're going to go. You might find, after 2 or 3 days walking, you're feeling a bit stiff and you don't want to walk as far, so don't feel you have to, push to where you've booked. Alternatively, you might really get into it and find that you want to walk a longer distance, or, it can be many, many reasons. I think it's generally accepted by most people who've walked a Camino that it's not always a great idea to try and book accommodation, for your whole trip, because it's generally not going to work for you. So what I said to him was, again, if you're walking the Camino Frances, there's a lot of the accommodation will be on booking.com, which is a very simple way to book if you're not confident phoning or anything like that. So just do that. And you only really need to book the next night. So, wherever you're staying tonight, this is what Pat and I do. We have a look and say, well, we're happy to walk to, that sort of distance. We'll go there tomorrow, and we'll have a look around on booking.com and we'll book the one for tomorrow. Once you've got your bed booked, you don't really have to sort of worry about what time you're going to arrive, within reason. You can set off 9 or 10 o'clock, as I said, and sort of be behind the crowd a bit. So that's accommodation options. I mentioned the Compostela, the certificate. So if you want that, you will have to walk the final 100 kilometres of one of the routes. If you don't need that, then that opens up your options really to walk any section you want. The other thing I would just talk about is gear. So, I mean, I'm a bit of a Camino nut. I'm a bit of a gear junkie. I like to walk with gear that's going to help me in the journey in terms of, keeping me comfortable and making sure my feet are okay and things like that. So, over the years, I've probably spent a bit on comfortable hiking gear. I mean, these are like merino shirts and things that I wear. They're quite expensive. The hiking shoes and so on can be quite expensive. If you're going to walk 4 or 5 days, you don't need any of that stuff. Whatever you wear for a country walk at home, that'll be fine. Just make sure that you've got a rain jacket or something, because it does rain in Spain, and you'll be fine. If you're just going to sample the Camino and try it out, I wouldn't go buying any special stuff at all. If you try it out and then you think, this is fantastic, I'd love to go and do one of 500 Ks or something, then you might want to have a look at different equipment. The other thing, and again, the purists are not going to like me saying this, but if you are just sampling the Camino and you want to see if you like it and you want to see if you like the vibe, and like in the example with my friend, they're going to Italy for a month, the Camino is really just a little bit of a sampler on the way there. What I said to him was, do not worry about, getting all the gear and a hiking backpack and all the rest of it. Carry a day pack. Just carry a day pack with your rain jacket and your food and things like that. Don't even buy any special luggage. Just use the suitcase that you're going to take to Italy and have that transported every day. And it's a very simple system. All of the accommodation has a range of luggage transport options available. I think the municipal albergues don't like you transporting luggage, so they won't have them, but most accommodation places will have the little envelopes at reception and help you book, the luggage transfer for the next days and things. So if you're sampling it, I'd kind of take the easy option, to be honest. To me, sampling the Camino is about, it's not trying to do an ultra hike or anything like that. It's about getting a little bit of exposure to the Camino and what it's really about, and having some great walks out in beautiful countryside, meeting some of the fellow pilgrims, soaking up some of the culture. If you enjoy it, then that's great. Then you can sort of try and do it, carrying all your stuff in a backpack and staying in albergues and, go the whole hog. But you don't need to do that, just try it out, I'd suggest. There we go. So, and my friend did make one remark, because he was having a look at my blog and sort of, this place looks interesting and that one's interesting. And he said, I see you only spent one night in Pamplona. And I said, yeah, look, it's a great city. And there are some great towns and cities, in Spain and along the Camino, the different Camino routes. But for me, at least, the Camino is about the walking. And I don't feel I really want to stay in the towns and cities very much. I did explain to him, that you're probably going to get to the towns and cities, depending where you are, early afternoon, and you'll have time to look around, and that's fine. But from my perspective, and it's purely my perspective, the Camino for me is about the walking. And, with the big cities like Pamplona, I mean, I love Pamplona, but I can't wait to get out the next morning and get on that path heading to Alto del Perdón. It's being out in the countryside, out in the fresh air, and that almost walking meditation that is the Camino that I think makes it very special. And that's probably why I'd suggest, if you're going to sample it, to walk, a number of days in a row without sort of skipping using transport, because you'll kind of get into that rhythm, and you'll start to get a sense of what it's like maybe walking a longer distance, if you want to consider that in the future. It really is just about being out in the beautiful landscapes and having that sort of walking meditation and just chilling and relaxing and letting go. That's really what it's all about for me. So there you go. if you have had friends bore you stiff about the Camino and you don't want to ask them because they're going to bore you even more with more stories, maybe you're thinking, you know, oh, we could try a few days here and there, you know, what's involved, what could we do? You know, hopefully there's a few tips on this video for you. One last thing I will mention, and I did look at this for my friend because I thought if he's only going to walk 4 or 5 days, he could actually book a tour. And there are a number of, if you just Google Camino Tours, there's a number of companies that will organise all the accommodation, the luggage transfers, the meals, and all the rest of it. You know, so if you're sort of very nervous about being in a foreign country and having, you know, to organise all the logistics, that's an option for you. And I know quite a few people who have done those tours and then later on felt confident enough to organise their own Caminos. I would say if for some reason you're very nervous about organising it all yourself, you know, try that. The only thing I would say, I think it's totally unnecessary. If you're able to get yourself, you know, let's take Pamplona as the example. If you're able to get yourself to Pamplona and get onto booking.com and you're able to book yourself a little hotel in Puente La Reina online, that's about as much as you need to do in terms of logistics. And by doing that, you're going to feel a much greater sense of freedom and flexibility without having to stick to someone else's schedule. And, you know, I imagine it's a bit like being on a sort of coach trip, you know, we're all leaving at such and such a time in the morning. You know, so I don't think you kind of need that, really. There you go. Let me know down below if that's been helpful and if it horrified you that I'm promoting Touringrinos. I just thought it's a way for people to try the Camino and see if they like it, you know, without having to sort of go full hog, you know, dip your toe in the water and see if you like it. And then if you do like it, well, you can come back and do it the traditional way, if there is a traditional way. But there you go. I've waffled on long enough. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.